Okay. Hello, everyone. This is a new episode of our Sounds Like Sustainability Conversations that we're doing in collaboration with the International Environmental Communication Association. And I'm pretty excited because this is a bit of a special edition today. Special because it's not announced. It's not super interactive during the session, but everyone is, as always, invited to be interactive and get into a dialogue with us after the session and when we share it. It's also really special because we're doing this more or less spontaneously today. I feel very privileged to have Professor Erich Sommerfeld with me today, bringing in a strategic communication perspective on sustainability thinking, sustainability communication, but also corporate social responsibility communication, and thinking about organizations and of all kinds, scope and shape and purpose. So we're starting with a organizational perspective on communicating about sustainability, or maybe not, and we will tackle a couple of questions around that. As always at the beginning, I would love to ask you to say hello to everyone and just start with telling everyone very briefly, what is important for you in this context of communication and responsibility and trust. And thanks for being here.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm Erich Sommerfeld. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota, and my background is in strategic communication, particularly in public relations. I'm the editor-in-chief of Public Relations Review, which is the largest, oldest journal dedicated to the study of public relations. But I began my scholarly career studying activism, particularly LGBT activism, but also environmental activism. And so sustainability has been peeked into my scholarship and my career over the years here and there, even though I would not call myself necessarily a sustainability expert. But the field of public relations and business communication in particularly has become so heavily dominated by studies centered on corporate social responsibility. And a large part of that is environmental responsibility, is sustainability communication, because it has become such a prominent feature of what we expect from contemporary organizations. We expect organizations and corporations to take public stances on controversial social issues, including environmental issues, which, by the way, now are not deemed to be controversial at all, really. I mean, everybody is pretty on board with the idea of, green energy, sustainability, recycling, all these sorts of ideas. It just depends on how the organization chooses to align that communication with their mission and vision, and how they position it as part of their value propositions, who they are as an organization. We know that through a lot of corporate social responsibility research, that if the proposition or the statements they're making through their corporate social responsibility initiatives, if it's not aligned with or reflective of the image of the organization, the benefit for the organization is not going to be there, right? Because their audiences, their publics are not making the connections. There has to be an authentic value overlap between how they're selling themselves through any social issue, really, but in this case, sustainability. And they have to show, how that's part and parcel of who they are as an organization, not just an add-on, right? So CSR initiatives are not effective when they're just deemed to be tacked on as a nice thing to have or a nice thing to do. People have to see it as an integral part of who the organization is. So you have to really sell yourself from a core perspective of who you are as an organization, that we are indeed invested in sustainability. We are indeed invested in green energy, recycling, whatever. It's part of who we are. And if you don't convince people that's how it is, it's more than likely not to go very well from you. It will go very well for you. And I think that's what we've seen now through 10 plus years of CSR research. And a lot of it has been in, environmental and sustainability issues.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this kind of taking us on the journey of think your journey of thinking about corporate social responsibility and this focus on environmental sustainability or responsibility towards nature and towards the environment. There were three aspects that I find particularly interesting in what you said. Let's start with the first one. What is sustainability? Because what I heard was that sustainability is somehow a value or a principle of action that should be deeply rooted in organizations or cultivated in organizations. And only if it is this kind of principle that guides or directs all the organizational action, including communication, then it can be authentically and transparently communicated to the outside. Would you agree on that, or what is sustainability? Because I try to not get trapped too much in this definition of sustainability as, oh yeah, it's the way how we deal with resources, because that is, I try to lift us up as communication scholars and social scientists to a more abstract level, to understanding what, or challenge us to understand what is sustainable, what does it do, how do we grasp it from a conceptual level? Is the value, does it have the potential to be a universal value, something like democracy? No, is it like a very basic principle of how we do things?
Yeah, I think now you position it alongside democracy. I think that the Gen Z and millennials in particular see sustainability as like a core value, right? And I think that they've now seen the consequences of decades of abuse of non-sustainable practices of environmental abuse, right? So we've come to see the expectation that products and services must come from companies who are dedicated to sustainability because they have a much more longer term orientation towards the environment, the effects it's going to have on them, whereas previous generations who might be seen as perpetuating and non-sustainable practices or environmentally unfriendly practices, the consequences are here, right? The consequences are tangible. And so we see very young people now really resenting that and adopting sustainability as a core principle or core value of who they are. So it's essential as democracy. I mean, it's essential as the air we breathe, right? So you're thinking about sustainability and, the health of the air we breathe, the water that we drink. When you have a group of people, a demographic who is extraordinarily pessimistic about the future, and they are insistent that organizations adopt these sustainable practices, whereas previous generations did not because they perhaps didn't see the consequences of these actions. But now we're seeing them unfold in real time. So you have a whole generation of people who are less pessimistic about the future, less optimistic about the future. So I think it is this notion of what it means to be sustainable and how it is related to who we are as people. I think it's shifted in the culture, in Western culture. I've certainly seen it in the United States as well, is that we used to be much more of a disposable culture, but I see the attitude among a large swath of certain demographics very much shifting, and the expectations that corporations adopt those values, and those values are in alignment with how people want to live their lives, and in the hopes that millennials don't want, I mean, Gen Zs don't want to have kids because they are afraid of what the world is going to bring for them politically, environmentally, and all these sorts of things. So we are adopting sustainability as a core value, what it means to be human, and that expectation must be manifest in the organizations that we support and the products that we buy, because it's becoming that much more important for people. I think that's probably my observation.
But do you think sustainability is a term that actually works globally? So is it something that actually works for people? You have a lot of experiences going through projects, working across the globe. Would you think that sustainability as a framework, sometimes sustainable development goals, 17 amazing, colorful presented goals, do they actually work in, let's say, very different contexts?
I've never been I've worked a lot in international development and public diplomacy, etc. And so we're a big fan of the UN or other bodies and things like that, of laying out like 5 core principles or 5 goals by 2050 or whatever it is. Um, and most people don't have any connection to the United Nations or other environmental bodies, right? So they could care less if there's a set of core principles out there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what we have learned through strategic communication practice is that there's no such thing as effective universal communication. I mean, values and ethics are not universal. They are very localized. So it's very difficult for any effective communicator, any effective organization to say, these are our values, these are our ethics, and they're universal across the globe. It just doesn't work, right? I mean, and in our mind's eye, we might say that, what is ethical here must be ethical over there. And so we have to practice the same thing. That's not true. It's not true. So how are we going to and the way people think about the environment and waste and sustainability is likely to vary based on context and culture and very greatly. So, adopting a rigid set of practices or a framework or set of principles in one place and attempting to pick it up and putting it down without altering it in someplace else it's a recipe for failure. Because you have to be, adapt to global communication, have global practices adapting to local problems, local cultures, local expectations. So that applies to any kind of strategic communication practice and for sustainability as well. People have a different relationship with the environment in different places around the globe, and how they think about it. And that's culturally, religiously, but you don't understand what I'm saying. It's a very, very, very adaptable relationship. So if you're working in sustainability communications, you have to, like any good communicator, you have to adapt to local cultures and local practices. You know?
So this is always where my thinking then starts in terms of like, shouldn't we move away from a very functionalist understanding of communication, very managerial approach in terms of, okay, linear communication, like we see, okay, what are the expectations of my stakeholders there, and blah, blah. And then I instrumentalize communication and I see communication as a way to get my messages across, even if they are adapted to a local context. So this is the moment where I feel like, okay, let's move away from that and move towards an understanding of communication, which includes more conversational approaches, which includes thinking about, okay, shouldn't we, I don't know, create spaces where people can then renegotiate the meaning of sustainability, renegotiate those goals that are set up on a global level, but then so of course we can craft it down, we can translate it to a local context and adapt to that context. But by the same time, we could conceptualize it the other way around and say, okay, why don't we just, spark conversations in those places or at those places and try to open up the space for conversations, which is probably where your experience in activism also comes in, because this is what this.
Well, that only works if you actually have intention of being open to adaptation, right? And, so there's decades of international development practice where we say we're going to open up a dialogue, we're going to, bring in educational resources and try to, figure out what it means together. But very rarely are development actors or people coming in setting up spaces like this. Very rarely are they actually interested in having their point of view altered, right? So we set up spaces that are, it's just a masquerade for another type of one-way communication, right? So take for example, the history. Take for example the history of coca farming in South America. United States for decades in the war on drugs tried to persuade farmers in Bolivia to plant coffee as opposed to coca. The coca plant is a traditional flower. It's also used in the production of cocaine, but there's centuries worth of traditional uses for the coca plant as well, such as tea and medicinal things. So they opened up dialogic spaces. They opened up town halls. They opened up resources for why planting coffee is better than planting coca. And they had no intention of changing, right? They just said they were, going to give the farmers money and they were going to give them in. And in the end, it actually, one could say that it was a benefit to the farmers in Bolivia because they made more money planting coffee, right? Well, they had no intention of having a real dialogue. about what it meant to be, so there's a long, long history of sustainability and other actors going into underprivileged spaces and saying, let's have a dialogue when there's no, it's just a top down, just another means to get what they want in a more faux participatory environment.
What is the way out then? Because I thought a lot about that. And one critical aspect of all the dialogue concepts that I always have is, or one critical perspective on that is that it's always oriented towards creating concepts.
Mhm.
Like this kind of this idea of if we only talk for long enough, we will end up with an agreement. And don't we need more spaces where we agree to disagree, where we kind of allow conversations that are more critical?
Sure. But that presumes you have organizations that are willing to accept risk, right? Any relationship with having has an element of risk to it.
Yeah.
Most organizations are not willing to give up that amount of power or to be open to, risk or damage or whatever it might be. So, this, I've seen time and time again in development initiatives and other kinds of things where these dialogues are really just masquerades for one-way communication. They're really just masquerades as functional communications. So yeah, we can preach it all we want, but it's very hard to convince people in positions of power to give up any power, to accept any amount of risk.
What is the potential that you see? So I've been lately thinking a lot about disruption and why we need those moments of disruptions to, I think Leonard Cohen said this, you need those cracks to let the light in, or in this direction, so that you need more provocations and more disruptions, so that things actually break up, and then it's potentially easier for organizations to take a risk if someone else has had been really risky and really, it's been a pioneer in terms of opening up new space for then being a bit more, moving a bit further. So so it's a positive way. I know that it's a positive way to approach disruptions, to approach those pioneers in a good way.
I mean, it depends on who the nature of the disruption and who's initiating the disruption. I think activist disruption is among the most effective ways to move issues and ideas forward. I mean, this is why I've been, a champion of activist ideation and theory for so long, is that they are probably if we flip the switch on strategic communication practice and think about activists as like the people who really, we often think about public relations, advertising, marketing as a business communication function, but really it was activists who kind of adopted these practices way before businesses did, right? So activists are the ultimate disruptors and the ultimate narrative changers, right? And once the narrative has been changed, right, or the nature of an idea has been set, it's very difficult there's a phrase in crisis communication called the tyranny of the definition. Like once definitions are set, they're like a tyrant. They're very hard to overthrow. A tyrant's very hard to overthrow. It's like, so you want to set the narrative, you want to set the definition for an issue, right? So if you successfully disrupt communications about something and you set the narrative, everybody else is trying to overthrow your narrative, your definition, just like a tyrant. So I mean, if you're successful in that, in disrupting conversations about sustainability, about whatever it might be, then you've really done the initiative or the area of emphasis a favor, because like, okay, hey, we are now the ones that have shaped the contours of this issue now. And that can happen through disruption. So I'm always a big fan of activist communication stepping in, because often it's the only time any substantive movement happens. So,
Okay, last question. How do you teach your students to be more activist? Because that's always, it's somehow at the end the the point where I get to, like, how can I actually initiate or at least stimulate or poke the students to think about, okay, the own agency or the own authorship to write those narratives or to create those narratives or stand behind those new narratives. It's a tricky one. I know that, and I know that's always a matter of our context, but
well, I think it's a matter of you're going to have certain students who are always going to be apathetic, right? But there's the ones who are genuinely interested in shaping the course of their lives and recognizing how the actions of others, of businesses, of politics, or how that's going to steer the course of their lives. And you say, okay, don't be apathetic. You actually, activists are the only ones that have made any substantive change in the direction of the course of politics, of environmentalism, of women's rights, LGBT rights, etc. And so the people who are, how to overcome apathy, I think is one of the biggest contemporary challenges, because you have a lot of people resigned to the fact that this is the way things are, and the problems seem so overwhelming that why bother? Why bother investing time and resources and making sure the environment's going to be, healthy 50 years from now? Or why bother trying to preserve a democratic society, right? Because, it's much easier just to sit at home and play your video games, right? And just, keep yourself comfortable. And being an activist is inherently uncomfortable, right? You have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And shaking things up. And that's not in everyone's character. It's not in everyone's character to be uncomfortable. And so particularly when it comes to sustainability, preservation of individual, civil liberties and democratic freedoms and all these sorts of things, it takes people who are willing to go out and do the uncomfortable things. So I think that's for most social issues, not just sustainability.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Be uncomfortable. Little message at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Really appreciate it.